Well, everybody, we have finally arrived. We were featured in a viral video. Now, it wasn't a video on our own channel. It was actually on the YouTube channel Fern, and that channel has over 4 million subscribers, and they released a video entitled Why Everybody Hates Lego. And we were featured within the first minute of that video. And in fact, I think we were the first of the many YouTube channels that they featured in that video, or at least the first one with audio. So it was really impressive that we were part of that video. Thank you, Fern, for featuring us. We appreciate it. And thank you to all the fans who commented on our other video saying, hey, you were featured here. So what I want to do in this video is actually analyze the arguments that were made in Fern's video on a couple of different dimensions. One, does the evidence that they cite to make their points, the small points within the argument, make sense? And then I also want to analyze whether or not the overall argument makes sense. At the end, then, I will talk about what it's like to have to be fair and objective when we criticize Lego and what that looks like in the context of our channel. Before I get into analyzing the merits of the argument that Fern makes, I do want to provide a synopsis of the video. It's about 30 minutes long, and the video starts with the history of Lego, and then it goes to the present, and then it goes back into the history and to the present. And in doing so, what they are trying to convey is that Lego has evolved over time from a small family business to a corporate giant. And they also are implying throughout this video that Lego started with some core principles, namely that this is going to be a high quality toy for kids that gives them a meaningful experience at a reasonable price. And then at some point along the way, Lego has lost that vision. And they imply certainly heavily, if not outright say, that Lego is not what they used to be on those fronts. Now, specifically, they make some arguments related to some questionable legal practices, the prices of sets, the quality control or lack thereof, as well as some other things that lead them to conclude that there's a huge problem at Lego right now, and indeed up to the point where, according to the title, everybody hates Lego. So let's dive into some of these arguments and look at the evidence that they provide. And I want to first start off by one of the better arguments that they make, and that is pricing. We've talked a lot about pricing on this channel, and the data that Fern uses goes up through 2024. So it doesn't include 25 and 26, which I think is important when we consider that prices, from what I can tell and some of the analyses that I've run internally that we haven't done videos on yet, prices have gone up a little bit from 2024 to present day. So it doesn't account for those increases, but they do a really nice job of showing what the pricing of Lego looks like, especially over time. For instance, and I'll show you some of these infographics that they produced, they show that Lego has increased in price over time. And they also show that the number of pieces included in the average Lego set has also increased. And in fact, they show that the prices are different among the various themes. You will see some prices higher for licensed themes on average than you might see for non-licensed themes. Now, they could have done a little bit more in terms of these statistical analyses to determine if this is just a one-off from the particular year or sample of years that they use, but I think they do show that there is a reasonable, at least from a fan perspective, discrepancy in some of those prices. What's also interesting is they demonstrate that controlling for inflation, that the price of Lego per piece on average has actually dipped significantly since the 1980s, which is an argument we've made here before, and has been relatively consistent over the last 20 years at a little above 10 cents per piece. Now, they also do a nice job of acknowledging that the price per piece ratio is not the be-all end-all of value. In fact, they talk about a number of sets, giving some specific examples that fans are puzzled by the price for that set compared to others. And I definitely think that Lego, while they have talked about what goes into price, there's certainly that little element of the price that they don't get into all the details. We know sometimes it's probably a bit more than the license fee, the minifigs, and the pieces, whether it's the molds, new molds, rare colors, and things like that. There's probably a little bit of a markup depending on what Lego thinks demand might be. So they do a pretty solid job over there. But another point that they make that I don't think they do quite as well handling is the lack of quality control, or the slip in quality of Lego as a product. Now, as I mentioned, they go through some of the core principles of Lego back from the 1950s, which included a high quality product, and then they contrast that with today, where they have a bunch of Lego YouTubers talk about how there are some problems with Lego. And I will acknowledge that there are some issues with color discrepancies and other things with Lego. For instance, just this month I was building the Ford Model T. We got that set brand new and it was missing a piece. And just like it happened in the 1980s when I was a kid, you would call, at least in the 80s, now you go online and you relay that missing piece to customer service and they send it. In the case for the Ford Model T, I haven't received the piece yet, but I know that it is en route. So I think there's a difference there between missing a piece in a set, which happens occasionally. I would say that of the sets we've purchased over the last 20 years, it's 2% or less would have a missing piece. And I don't know if that's high or low. In fact, that's one of the things I thought was interesting and missing from the argument that we have here. To convince me that Lego is no longer the quality product it was before, they needed to demonstrate what it was at the beginning. And if your problem is quality control now, show me what quality control was like back then. And they didn't provide a lot of evidence for that. In fact, there are a number of things that I think go into Lego having a harder time with quality control now, including the increased number of production facilities that they have, as well as the number of molds and colors that they have in production. It's a lot easier to be consistent with colors when you're only producing a handful of them like they did in the 1970s and 80s. As you get into the 2010s and now 2020s, you've got a lot more colors, and I think it's more difficult to keep an eye on all of those things and make sure that everything is uniform. That's not an excuse for Lego, because we've talked about color variations in the past on this channel, in fact, even recently, but I do think it would be worthwhile that to make that point more convincing, you would show me evidence of what it was like in the 1980s and 1990s, or even back into the 1970s. So I think that was a missed opportunity there by Fern, although I think the overarching point remains. There were a couple of other points that I didn't find nearly as convincing. One of those was comparing one of the Formula One cars to a similar one done by a Chinese company called Kata. And this part of the video, they were talking to a Lego critic who I think had at one point been a Lego reseller, got into a legal battle with Lego, lost that battle, and then has become a vocal critic. And the comparison between the Lego version and the Kata version was apparently night and day, and the Kata version was much better. Here's what I am skeptical of this kind of an argument, and that is, well, when you take a look at some of these companies, particularly those that are owned by China or Chinese-owned companies that are very likely getting subsidized by the government, we don't know whether they're making money. We do know that Chinese companies are oftentimes undercutting other companies from Western countries, developed countries, in order to get into the market. And so they could be taking huge losses on that set just to get under Lego's prices and increase their market share. And because they're subsidized by the Chinese government, A, not only do you have that benefit in your back pocket, even though it could be very, very economically inefficient, but B, because China is a communist regime, you're not going to have the transparency there. And so we don't know if that company is even making money, whereas for Lego, they release their financial reports every single year. In fact, they typically do a mid-year financial report as well, so that we know a little bit about what's going on. And those are open to the public, and we did a video on their 2025 report just a week or so ago. Another component to this that I don't like for the comparison is that Chinese-owned companies, we don't know for sure, but we think, and it's very reasonable to suspect, that they're using much cheaper labor that violates what we would consider in developed countries normal labor laws. And so I don't know that the cost of production there is on equal footing with what you would see for Lego or other competitors of Lego that are in, say, Germany or other countries that are developed and have those rules and regulations in place where violations can be prosecuted in court. So I didn't find that one very convincing. And then the last one I'm going to talk about before moving on to our second dimension of our analysis here is that the same Lego critic talked about how Lego will fill the inside structure of sets with multiple bright colors, and that was a way for Lego to say, well, you know, you take this apart, you can't build something else with it because of these brightly colored pieces that we've included, so now you have to buy more Lego. Now, Fern, I think, does a very nice job of deflecting this by saying that, well, that's also due to cost efficiency. We want to make sure that we are using maybe surplus pieces here so that we can put more pieces in or maximize the budget. And we know from interviews that I've watched with Lego set designers that this is what they do. They know which pieces might be a little bit cheaper, that even a fraction of a penny, you can put additional pieces in there and make the minifig slightly better or open up the budget for some additional elements. So the cost effectiveness there is the good part of what I saw for how they've handled that. Overall, when it comes to the internal consistency of their arguments and the validity, it was a little bit of a mixed bag. They got some parts right, but I think they left out some key perspectives, or they missed some opportunities to make those arguments a little bit more convincing. Let's now talk about the overarching argument, which is at the very minimum that because Lego has lost its way over the evolution of their history, that people now strongly dislike Lego, or as the title says, everyone hates Lego. So I think in this way, they make three fatally flawed arguments, and I was kind of disappointed overall with the execution of this argument. First of all, of course, I want to highlight that anytime someone says everyone hates Lego or everyone hates X, it's clearly not right. But I will give them some latitude in wanting to get people to click on it. But was I convinced that because of what they demonstrated in the video, the evidence, that the overall point was made? And the answer, I'm just gonna be honest, no. Like I said, three fatally flawed components of the argument. The first one is a logical flaw that I saw in the argument, which is to say that they focused on a lot of criticisms that adults have of Lego, and they didn't focus on criticisms that kids might have of Lego. And even though Lego has increased their targeting of adults as an audience for buying their product, we know that kids comprise a lot of things. There were a number of instances where I saw this take place. One, as I mentioned, was with the brightly colored bricks in the center of Lego set structures. My kids love that. I like that because it gives us brightly colored bricks that we may not get a lot of in our normal purchasing of sets. And we don't have to go on Bricklink or Lego Pick and Build online or to the pab wall of the Lego store and get some of those bricks. We have them in our collection when we take them apart. I don't have a problem with that, and I don't think a lot of people do as well. Furthermore, when it comes to stickers, this is one of the arguments that they made in the video, how Lego has included a lot of stickers in 18+ sets that are supposed to be premium. And I think there's a point to be made there. But do kids care about that? If we're talking about everyone hating Lego, where's that component? Where do kids have a problem with stickers? I remember when I was a kid, I didn't care whether it was a sticker or not. As an adult, I care a bit more, but I wanted to see some evidence that suggested that this was a systematic problem of more than just 18+ sets. And indeed, back when I was a kid, Lego didn't make 18+ sets, so it's very difficult to make the argument that Lego has fallen down in this area, even though I tend to agree with the overall sentiment that fewer stickers should be placed in the 18+ sets, if at all, and certainly not on the back of panels and over curved pieces or where the display value is affected by your ability to place a sticker perfectly, like with the Gringotts Bank. But leaving out that kid component in that argument, I think, is a problem for demonstrating that this is a systematic problem with the entire audience of Lego. The second fatal flaw, and again, it's a logical flaw, is that they conflate criticism with at least dislike, if not hatred, of Lego. And they also don't do a very good job of telling us whether it's the product or the company. So let's talk a little bit about this. Is it possible for someone to criticize Lego as a company or a product and still like or even love both? Yes, I have criticized Lego. I've done it multiple times where I believe that it is necessary, but I still love Lego the product and even like Lego the company. And in fact, many of the other YouTube channels highlighted, such as Tiago Catarino or Brixie, I know that they like Lego because they say it. There's no reason why you would spend your entire life, your livelihood predicated on Lego bricks and reviewing them and building with them, to hate the product or even hate the company, especially when those two are in the Lego Ambassador Network and receive a bunch of free sets. So just because you can be critical of something doesn't mean you dislike it or hate it, nor does it show that it is a widespread problem. And in fact, if you take a look at this, I'm seeing a modification to the title, which is, well, there are some people who don't like what Lego's doing in some small circumstances, but still spend a lot of money on Lego. It's not quite the same catchiness of everybody hates Lego. Now, the third flaw that I saw in this argument overall is empirical. And the data that they show in the article itself actually suggests the exact opposite of their title. If everyone hates Lego, then answer this question. Why has Lego seen record revenues over the last couple of years? Why has Lego had record profits? Why does Lego release more products each year, setting records there? And why, as the video states, are they reaching new audience that they've never reached before in different continents and growing in some of those areas? If everyone hates Lego, or if a lot of people around the entire audience of Lego dislikes the company and or the product, then how is it that we are seeing Lego become not only the #1 toy company in the world, but doing so at a very quick rate and growing that margin between them and the other competitors? They even show the infographic that has Lego #1, other ones have flatlined. How is it then that we can conclude that there is a huge problem with Lego that is undermining their popularity? If anything, you could actually title the video, "Why Lego is the most popular toy company in the world." That would actually be an accurate title based on some of the data that show, even though there are criticisms. So let's revise that title. Despite some criticisms, Lego is at its peak. That could very easily be the title based on the data and evidence that I saw in that video. So I'm going to be honest, that whole argument completely swing and a miss. So let's now talk a little bit about what this means in the big picture. And I gotta say that it's really interesting observing the metrics on our own videos and what it looks like when we're positive about Lego versus when we're negative about Lego. I think there's for sure an element of being critical about Lego that provides a rush for a lot of people. People like to comment about particular sets that they don't like, or they like to complain about certain things that Lego is doing that they don't like. And what we end up seeing is that the people who like and are okay with the status quo, they don't always comment, but they end up being the vast majority of Lego fans. As somebody who works in education, I can tell you that the people who don't like you are going to speak up. The people who are perfectly fine with you just move on with their lives because they're okay with it. And to them, it's just normal. And that's what we see with Lego, that when Lego releases good products, people are fine, they're happy, and they go on their way. And most people, that's fine, that works. But when Lego does something that somebody doesn't like, they will get involved by typing, comments out there, whether it's on Reddit or Brickset or whatever forum or on YouTube videos. And so negativity definitely sells. Now, from our perspective, negativity is something that we will employ occasionally when we believe it is warranted. When Lego does something that we don't like, we will say that. Our goal here is to be reasonably objective. From the starting point of this is a Lego YouTube channel, and we love Lego, and we like the company, and we want it to do better, I will criticize Lego. Constructive feedback is an important thing. And consider this channel, the views that it gets, the subscribers that we have, as well as many other channels in that family of let's make this the best product we possibly can. So I don't think it's a problem to criticize Lego. What I will note, and we did a video recently where we talked about how people that Lego's listening to fans, and that's a good thing. We actually had a number of people unsubscribe from the channel watching that video. Now, I don't know why they unsubscribed. The editing was about the same. The delivery of content was the same. The only thing that changed was the argument. And it could be, I don't know if it's for sure, there's uncertainty there, but it's plausible that some people were like, oh, you actually think Lego's doing well? Unsubscribe. And we've had that happen before, where people are just like, well, you're just a shill for Lego, unsubscribe. Guys, we've been critical of Lego, and we will, but we also like Lego, and we are going to appreciate when they do things well. It works both ways. And I think if you're being honest, that you have to acknowledge that the #1 toy company in the world has done a few things right over the years, even if not everything is perfect. And I think that's the important thing. Let's continue to make Lego and give them feedback so that they can do a better job while we can still enjoy their product. Now, I've left a link to the Fern video in the description down below, so I hope you're able to check that out if you haven't already. Again, look for that cameo appearance in the 52-second mark there. Of course, it was back before we renovated our Lego room, so it looks a little bit different. But thank you so much for watching this video, and always remember to keep building together.